see now mechanisms, including the trade agreements, the TPP and the CAFTA, and we watch this spectacle where our elected officials are not allowed to speak to us about dramatic trade agreements that will erase what few regulations we have left on the environment and what few protections we have for American working men and women. Even if they take notes on it, when they leave the room, they have to surrender the notes. As some of you may know, I sued the President in federal court over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. Section 1021 of the NDAA allows the U.S. military, or authorizes the U.S. military, overturning over 150 years of domestic law and defying the Constitution prohibition on the use of the military as a domestic police force, to seize U.S. citizens who quote-unquote substantially support, that's not a legal term, that's not material support, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, which again is a nebulous term. Strip them of due process and hold them indefinitely in military facilities. Judge Catherine before us in the Southern District Court of New York, to our surprise, and the surprise of almost everyone else, declared that section unconstitutional and issued a temporary injunction. Now, the response of the Obama administration was telling. The day she gave her ruling, they appeared in her chambers, not just the federal attorneys, but the attorneys from the NSA and the internal security apparatus, and demanded, in the name of national security, that she revoke the temporary injunction and put the law back into effect. And to her credit, she refused. And she wrote a very powerful 112-page opinion on her ruling, which is worth reading, where she said that this law opens the way for the government to criminalize an entire category of people. And she evokes the internment of the 110,000 Japanese Americans in World War II. That was a Friday afternoon by 9 a.m. Monday morning. Those attorneys were in the offices of the Second Circuit, the Appellate Court of New York, demanding the same thing. And the Appellate Court conceded and put the law back into effect. Now, we knew they would appeal, but why? Why did they act so aggressively? Because we assumed, our supposition, is that they're already using the law. That there are U.S. Pakistani dual nationals in black sites like Bahrain. And if that injunction was allowed to stand, and those U.S. citizens got out, they could hold the government in contempt of court. And I cite this case because it's an example of how we are being stripped of our rights by judicial fiat, that the Constitution remains, but the reality of our constitutional rights are a mirage. So what was the Second Circuit going to do? Because it is a clear violation of our Constitution to throw our military on the streets to act as police. I had been a plaintiff as well in a case that reached the Supreme Court called Clapper versus Amnesty International, where we challenged the FISA Amendment Act, or warrantless wiretap, before the Snowden revelations. And government lawyers in the Supreme Court argued that we had no right to bring the case, I and the other plaintiffs, because the charge that there was surveillance or we were under surveillance was, in their words, speculation. They added that if the government was in fact carrying out surveillance against us, we would be informed. Clapper versus Amnesty International. Therefore, he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama. And they refuse to hear the case on its merits. And it remains law. And yet, when opinion polls call Americans, again, across the political spectrum, and ask them if they supported the NDAA, Section 1021, that provision had a 97% disapproval rating. And in the course of our lawsuit, we contacted the Democratic leadership in the House, Pelosi's office, and we said, if you will write into that section that U.S. citizens are exempt, we will drop our lawsuit. But they refused, because it was written for U.S. citizens. The state understands very well what's coming. They have run scenario after scenario about climate change, financial collapse. I'm not a Marxist, but the most pressing study of the nature of capitalism was done in Marx's first volume of Capital. And in his study of capitalism, he describes the inevitable deformity that capitalism becomes until the very forces that present themselves as capitalist entities recreate a system that destroys capitalism itself. And the examples I gave of the monopolies, of the large global banks that manipulated the currency, or the large financial houses and banks that feed off of the Fed, was all predicted by Marx, who said that in the end, as there is an impoverishment of working men and women, and increasingly the middle class, when that population is essentially starved of wages and can spend less and less, that capitalists will become loan sharks, global speculators, which inevitably, of course, is unsustainable. Then those forces cannibalize the very structures that make capitalism possible in the name of austerity. And they take it out on the backs of the poorest